EAA's webinars are made possible through the generous support of Aircraft Spruce and Specialty, serving homebuilders and EAA members since 1965. Tonight's presentation is titled Second Annual General Aviation Engine Summit. And Mike Bush is going to be talking to us about that. Mike is president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. He's an author for numerous aviation publications. He holds a CFI certificate, an A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization. He was the FAA Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year in 2008 and a member of EAA. Mike, thanks so much for being with us tonight, volunteering your time. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight, I wanted to do something, again, a little bit different. About 3 weeks ago, we had a two-day meeting with the FAA, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what transpired and just bring you up to date on what the meeting was about. This was a meeting that was billed as the second annual GA Engine Summit, and it was held at the FAA offices in Burlington, Massachusetts, just north of Boston. The first of these engine summits we had in December 2015, and they were supposed to occur annually, but for various reasons, including a big FAA reorganization I'm going to tell you about, this one wound up being delayed quite a bit, and we finally held it on September 12th and 13th of 2017, so about 3 weeks ago. It was hosted, as I said, up in the Burlington, Massachusetts offices of the FAA's Engine and Propeller Directorate. This is a meeting that was focusing on engines for general aviation aircraft. To be more accurate, it was hosted by the group that used to be called the Engine and Propeller Directorate, but weeks before this meeting took place, the FAA went through a big major reorganization, and the Engine and Propeller Directorate, in fact, all of the directorates went away, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But the group became the Engine and Propeller branch of the Policy and Innovation Division of the Aircraft Certification Service. That's a mouthful. And frankly, these guys kept having trouble not referring to themselves as the Engine Propeller Directorate, because that's what they've been for as long as I can remember. But the FAA just went through this big organization meeting. There were a lot of representatives of general aviation aircraft owners. Dave Ward from AOPA and Doug McNair of EAA were there. Zach Noble from the Helicopter Association. Roger Whittier, who's the president of the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association. My colleague Paul New, representing the Cessna Pilots Association, and I was there representing Savvy Aviation. So the aircraft owners were pretty well represented at this meeting. And industry was pretty well represented as well. People from Continental and Lycoming, Superior Airport Parts, Ram Aircraft, Hartzell Propeller, a number of other firms were at the meeting. And there was actually a representative from the NTSB at the meeting as well. One of the first things that we wanted to talk to the FAA about, because everybody was pretty confused about it, was this big reorganization I've been mentioning that the FAA was calling a realignment. I'm not sure exactly what the difference between a realignment and a reorganization is, but it was they pretty much threw out their org chart and started over again. And this reorganization or realignment, or whatever you prefer to call it, affected the two of the huge branches of the FAA, the Air Certification Service, or AIR, and the Flight Standards Service, or AFS. And both of these organizations went through just major reshuffling. Let me start with AIR. Those are the guys that we were meeting with. AIR is the Aircraft Certification Service under Durenda Baker. Durenda continues to run it. She's a really good person. I had an opportunity to do quite a bit of business with her when she was running the Small Airplane Directorate some years ago. And the way the Aircraft Certification Service was organized prior to this big shakeup is basically portrayed here. And essentially, most of their work was organized into 4 organizations that they called directorates that were oriented towards what kinds of aircraft they were dealing with. There was a transport directorate that dealt with the big iron stuff. The Small Airplane Directorate, which we dealt with a lot, that dealt with small airplanes, that is airplanes 12,500 pounds and below. The Engine and Propeller Directorate, which are the folks that we were meeting with at this particular meeting, and the Rotorcraft Directorate. And each of these directorates had offices in different parts of the country. The Small Airplane Directorate was based in Wichita, Engine Propeller Directorate up in Burlington, Mass, just north of Boston, Rotorcraft Directorate down in Fort Worth. And this seemed to us to be a pretty, kind of user-oriented organization, so that when we had a small airplane issue, for example, we could go to the Small Airplane Directorate and be relatively assured that the people we were dealing with knew something about small airplanes and so on. So of these 4 directorates, the Small Airplane Directorate and the Engine Propeller Directorate were the ones that we mostly worked with. They were referred to by acronyms. Small Airplane Directorate was SAD, and Engine Propeller Directorate was EPD. And although these directorates were headquartered in Wichita and Boston, they worked through a bunch of field offices called ACOs, Aircraft Certification Offices. So most of the time when we were dealing with specific issues, we would be dealing with ACOs in the field. But when we had, a significant issue, we could go to the directorate headquarters in either Wichita or Boston and deal with the higher ups there. So that's the way it used to be. The directorates are now all gone. There are no more directorates after the reorganization. And the new AIR realigned org chart looks like this. In this big org chart, the folks that we will be dealing with going forward are primarily in these 2 groups down here: policy and innovation, and compliance and airworthiness, otherwise referred to as P&I and CNA. That's how they refer to themselves. Their official designations are AIR 600 for policy and innovation, AIR 700 for compliance and airworthiness. There are some other things that are going on here. For example, over at the very left-hand side of the org chart, you can see that there's a group called the Alternative Fuels Program Staff, AIR 20, headed up by Peter White. I'll be talking about his work a little bit later in the presentation, but they're the guys that are working on coming up with an unleaded substitute fuel to replace 100 low lead. And we were briefed on where they were in that process, and I'll talking about that in a little bit. But our primary interface with AIR going forward will be with the P&I and CNA groups. The thing that concerns me a little bit about this from a practical standpoint, we're going to have to see how it works out, is that the ACO offices that we deal with respect to airworthiness directives and stuff are now all under compliance and airworthiness. But the policy folks that are the people that we need to deal with when we don't like what the ACOs are doing are in this other organization called Policy and Innovation, or P&I. So instead of the ACOs being aligned under the directorates for the various kinds of aircraft, they're organized in a different way now. And we're going to have to see how this all works out. It's a little bit confusing, but at least we now have a little bit understanding of how it's supposed to work. Now, moving on to flight standards. Before the reorganization, flight standards, for as long as I can remember, has been organized into 7 regions. Flight Standards has 78 field offices called FSDOs, Flight Standards District Offices, which are the part of the FAA that most general aviation aircraft owners get to deal with, because they're the people who come around and ramp check us and all that sort of stuff. And the 78 FSDO offices reported to 7 regional offices throughout the United States. Alaska was the 7th region. As of a few months ago, when AFS reorganized, all these regions are now gone, at least as far as flight standards is concerned. So we still have the 78 offices, but they all report to headquarters. And I learned earlier today, because there'd been a lot of confusion about what these things are going to be called, that the Flight Standards District Offices, or FSDOs, are going to be renamed Flight Standards Offices, or FSOs, I guess they're going to be called, because it doesn't really make sense to have districts when you don't have regions. So this whole district and region structure goes away. The 78 offices remain. The personnel who work there basically remain, but they will wind up being called Flight Standards Offices in the future. And I found that out today from a guy at FAA headquarters, because this was very puzzling to us what they were going to be called. So at any rate, that's pretty much what we found out about the FAA reorganization. A little bit confusing. We're going to have to work a little bit to figure out how we do business with these folks under the new structure. The good news is that while the org charts have radically changed, the FAA is trying hard to make sure that most of our points of contact that we're used to using in the FAA will remain the same, at least for now, so that this reorganization, which, by the way, is at least as confusing to the FAA folks as it is to us, so that during this confusing period where everything is getting switched over, this reorganization is supposed to be relatively transparent to us, the FAA's customers. Okay, moving on, we had a very interesting presentation on electric propulsion by a fellow by the name of Gary Horan, who works in the Policy and Innovation Group and is the point person in what used to be called the Engine and Propeller Directorate for this new technology. And he gave us a very interesting presentation on what's going on in this area. He spoke about 2 categories of electric propulsion, what he called pure electric propulsion and hybrid electric propulsion. He said both are becoming viable for short-range, small manned aircraft now, and the change is happening very, very rapidly. We sort of get the impression that the FAA is a little bit overwhelmed at how many people are coming to them with electric aircraft designs, both pure electric and hybrid electric, that they want to get certified. And of course, the FAA doesn't really have any rules for certifying these things yet, and so they're scrambling to try to keep up. Gary said this feels like more like a revolution than an evolution. It's coming on very, very fast. Now, of course, electric propulsion is already the dominant propulsion mechanism for small unmanned aircraft systems or drones. But there's a lot of other stuff in the works. This is an electric aircraft being developed in Europe. This is the NASA electric propulsion X-plane. It's a 31-foot wingspan aircraft with 18 electric motors, 9 on each wing, in what's called a distributed propulsion scheme using lithium iron phosphate batteries. The FAA sees small aircraft that are powered by pure electrical propulsion as becoming big players by the end of this decade. We're talking about less than 3 years from now. So this is coming on quite rapidly. In the early 2020s, they expect to see the introduction of hybrid electric propulsion systems in aircraft weighing up to 19,000 pounds, a pretty significant aircraft. When they talk about hybrid electric propulsion systems, what they're talking about is pretty much like what you think about in a hybrid car. That is, there's a conventional fuel-burning engine, but instead of propelling the aircraft, it drives a generator and generates electricity. The electricity is stored in a battery, typically lithium-ion batteries, goes through some complicated solid-state power conditioning stuff, and then drives an electric motor that turns either a propeller, or a lot of these things are using ducted fans, and the term propulsor is coming into use. That's going to be interesting because we have lots of FAA certification regulations about propellers, but none about propulsors. So this whole thing is getting way ahead of the certification regulations, and the FAA is trying to scramble to catch up so that it will be in a position to certify these things. And that's going to be quite a challenge for the FAA. Here's a picture, by the way, of a hybrid electric air transport concept plane that NASA is running by, with a huge propulsor system in the back of it, as you can see. I don't know where in a timeline something like this might be. I assume this is quite a long way in the future, but small and medium-sized electric aircraft are apparently going to be happening much sooner than I thought, in any event. So the FAA's goal, in the spirit of the new Part 23 and so on, is instead of sitting in a dark room and making rules, their goal is to facilitate the development of industry-based standards for the approval of electric and hybrid electric propulsion systems. And to do this, they're working through an ASTM committee, F39.05. This is presently a committee with 16 members on it, of which 5 are from the FAA. So the FAA is taking a very, very active role in this consensus standards committee. They are right at the cusp of taking the first vote on a candidate consensus standard for what they call a simple base electric motor system. This would be the kind of pure electric propulsion system that would be used in small GA aircraft. And they're very close to approving a first draft of such a standard. Once the standard is established, then the FAA will create whatever regulations are required to provide certification to that standard, and then they'll be able to certify these aircraft. The next thing on their agenda, once they get this standard for the simple base electric motor, is to develop a standard for hybrid systems for Part 23 aircraft. Basically, GA singles and twins up to 12,500 pounds. Following that, they'll be dealing with commuter aircraft and Part 25 aircraft, which are transport aircraft, and that'll be a while before they get to that. But that's how they're prioritizing things. They're trying to come up with a standard for small GA electric aircraft first, and then tackling hybrid systems next, and then eventually commuters and air transport afterwards. The next presentation that we had was from Peter White. I pointed him out on the org chart earlier, who's the alternative fuels guy for AIR. And he's been heading up this effort to develop an unleaded replacement for avgas. And he gave us a pretty detailed briefing on where they are on that process. It's very well along, and it's looking like we should have a couple of approved alternative fuels sometime next year. This has been a multi-year effort. The effort is called PAFI, the Piston Aviation Fuel Initiative, which has been a government industry partnership to find a new unleaded aviation fuel that can be available across the GA fleet, under the assumption that 100 low lead is going to be going away. 100 low lead is considered at risk from several standpoints. The EAA is the EPA rather not EAA. Sorry about that. The EPA is making noises about regulating it out of existence. They're in the process of doing an environmental hazard study, but it's definitely at risk in terms of EPA regulation. There's been a lot of pressure from state and local governments, a bunch of lawsuits from local environmental groups. I know I'm based in California, although I'm in Boston at the moment, but in California there have been a bunch of lawsuits trying to prevent FBOs from selling 100 low lead. So far they haven't been successful, but it's been an ongoing struggle. And beyond all of the environmental stuff, the fact is that avgas is pretty much the only fuel left that uses tetraethyl lead, and tetraethyl lead, there's only one remaining supplier of tetraethyl lead worldwide. It's in the UK, and if something happens to it, either an industrial accident or they just decide that it's no longer economically viable to continue to produce it, there is not going to be any more tetraethyl lead. So from all of these standpoints, it's considered to be very important that we come up with a replacement fuel that isn't dependent on tetraethyl lead, both from the environmental standpoint and just the supply chain risk. It's not clear how long we have, how long it will be till 100 low lead goes away. It's pretty clear that it's going to be around for the next few years, but the handwriting is clearly on the wall that it's going to be going away, and there are roughly 167,000 GA aircraft that depend on 100 low lead fuel. So this PAFI effort started in 2013 when the FAA went out and solicited proposals from industry for unleaded substitute fuels that could be used in the general aviation fleet. By July 2014, the FAA had received proposals for 17 different formulations from 6 companies. They went through an assessment of these 17 formulations, looking for what the impact on the fleet would be. That is, what percentage of the aircraft could actually run on these fuels, the production and distribution implications, the environmental impact of the fuels, toxicology, cost of these fuels, and wound up eliminating all but 4 of the 17 formulations by September 2014. They accepted 4 formulations to go into the phase 1 testing program of PAFI. Phase 1, the testing is performed at the FAA's Tech Center, Williams J. Hughes Technical Center, Atlantic City. They use 6 different test rigs in their laboratories to evaluate cold and hot fuel performance, compatibility with common fuel system materials. This was a major concern with these fuels, is whether they were compatible with hoses and O-rings and fuel bladders and all the different kinds of materials that are in the fuel systems of our aircraft, and a number of them had problems with that. They also did some limited engine testing to evaluate these 4 fuels in terms of power and performance, anti-detonation properties, how easy it was to start the engines. Startability is affected dramatically by the volatility of the fuel, and so some of the candidates had problems with engine startability. They also evaluated these 4 candidates for cost, producibility, storage stability, how long they could sit in storage tanks without decomposing, and environmental risk. And by early 2016, phase 1 testing was completed, and 2 of the 4 candidate fuels survived the phase 1 process and were selected for phase 2 testing. And those 2 fuels were an unleaded UL 100 offering from Shell and a UL 102 offering from Swift Fuels. So those are the 2 candidates that's from, starting with those original 17 fuel candidates, they got whittled down to 2. And those 2 went into phase 2 testing last year. Phase 2 testing is now well underway, and it's scheduled to be completed early next year. The phase 2 testing includes both engine testing and aircraft testing. The engine tests that they're doing involve performance testing of 20 different engines of 15 different engine models, including Continentals, Lycomings, Rotax engines. There's one Pratt & Whitney radial engine in the engine tests. These things range from carbureted 4-cylinder engines to turbocharged injected 6-cylinder engines. 6 of the engines were used for detonation testing, with each of the 2 candidate unleaded fuels, and also with mixtures of these unleaded fuels with 100 low lead, in the anticipation that the transition from 100 low lead to these UL fuels will be gradual over time, and we during the transition time will wind up sometimes having both kinds of fuels pumped into our airplanes and mixing. So they're concerned about the ability of the engines to operate with mixtures of the new unleaded fuels and the existing 100 low lead fuel. 4 of the engines went through 400-hour block tests using each unleaded fuel. For a total of 3,200 hours of running time. A 400-hour block test is basically the same kind of test that they do when they certify a new engine, and it's pretty much a torture test. The aircraft tests that are going on involve 10 different aircraft models ranging from 2-place light trainers to high-performance twins, I think there's a Robinson R-44 helicopter that's part of the test group. So all of this stuff is going on right now and should be finished early in 2018. Now, once this PAFI testing is over, the FAA faces an interesting regulatory challenge because the FAA does not certify fuels. It certifies engines and aircraft to operate on specified fuels, but the FAA isn't in the business of specifying fuels. So it turned out that none of these UL candidates were what they call drop-in fuels. That is, none of them meet the 100 low lead spec. So none of the aircraft in our fleet are certified to operate on either of these unleaded fuels. And so how's the FAA going to deal with that? Well, doing it in the conventional way of certifying each individual aircraft and engine model for these fuels is just clearly impractical. It would take, decades to complete. So clearly the FAA needs to come up with some way of getting these fuels approved on a fleet-wide basis, not on a model-by-model basis. There just isn't time to do all of that. And the FAA does not have the authority to do that right now. So in order to get these fuels approved on a fleet-wide basis, the FAA is going to require new statutory authorization from Congress, and FAA and the fuels industry are presently working with Congress to try to get legislation passed to give the FAA the authority they need to get a fleet-wide approval for these new fuels, which is going to be an interesting challenge. So that's kind of where we are now on the fuels issue, and stay tuned. The testing should be over in 2018. Hopefully by then the FAA will have the authorization from Congress it needs, and then the challenge of deploying these new fuels and getting them out in the field and making the transition will go forward. So this is going to be something we're going to be dealing with for the next few years, but a lot of progress has been made, and we're homing in finally on a solution. There was an interesting presentation at this meeting given on general aviation power loss accidents. It was given by James Gray, who is an aeronautical engineer who specializes in doing statistical analysis and numerical risk analysis and so on for the group that used to be called the Engine and Propeller Directorate, and now has that long unpronounceable title. I guess it's the Engine and Propeller Division or something. But at any rate, he gave us an update on a study that the FAA has been doing on power loss accidents. It was a study of more than 700 general aviation power loss accidents that occurred during the period 2000 through 2014. And he gave us a lot of interesting charts and statistics and stuff, and I'll try to give you some of the highlights of the things that jumped out at me as being significant out of this presentation. We have 200 to 300 power loss accidents every year in the general aviation fleet. It sort of oscillates up and down, but it generally is in that range. Roughly 1 in 5 of those power loss accidents have been fatal accidents. About 50 fatal accidents a year are attributed to power loss. Interestingly enough, over the study period, the 14-year study period, or 15-year study period, the non-fatal accidents have been slowly declining, but the fatal accidents have been remaining pretty flat. So the percentage of these accidents that are fatal has been increasing, not because the fatals have been increasing, but because the non-fatals have been decreasing. Not sure what to make of that. A couple of very surprising things that came out of Jim's presentation. One hit me pretty hard because, as many of you know, I fly a twin Cessna. The rate of fatal power loss accidents is more than twice as high for twins as it is for singles. Now, I had always been taught that the rate of power of accidents in singles and twins were roughly comparable. And I always found it a little surprising that twins weren't safer than singles, but there are a lot of factors that come in there. It turns out that twin engine pilots tend to take more risks. They tend to tackle more difficult weather. They'll sometimes operate with known mechanical deficiencies that single engine pilots wouldn't dare to operate with, and so on. But to find out that the rate of fatal power loss accidents is more than twice as high for twins as for singles really surprised me. I guess it shouldn't have surprised me because, the second engine in a conventional twin is always trying to kill you because it causes a very difficult asymmetric thrust situation, which we spend tons of time training in the simulators and so on to know how to deal with. Every multi-engine pilot that's done any sim training has crashed and died a number of times in the simulator because it's not easy to handle those things, and it takes being very current and very proficient. Another interesting statistic was that the rate of fatal power loss accidents is 6 times higher for experimentals as it is for certified airplanes. That got Doug McNair's a little bit up and excited when that came out in the presentation. But it turns out that a lot of those fatal power loss accidents occurred during phase 1 flight testing of experimentals, that first 25 or 40 hours that you have to fly off when an experimental airplane is first allowed to fly, and when the pilot really is being a test pilot. My company is involved in an initiative with the AA of trying to come up with some tools for reducing the rate of power loss problems during phase 1 flight testing. But that's known in the experimental community as being a pretty serious problem, and there's quite a bit of attention being given to it by EAA and other people involved in the experimental and amateur build community. But anyway, that's kind of a startling statistic. Turns out that most power loss accidents, the overwhelming majority of power loss accidents, are caused by fuel issues. During the study period, there were 128 fuel starvation accidents, 93 fuel exhaustion accidents. By the way, the difference is fuel exhaustion means there isn't any more fuel. Fuel starvation means there's fuel in the airplane, but it's not getting to the engine, maybe because the pilot mismanaged the fuel selector or some other reason. 43 accidents caused by fuel contamination, and 31 carburetor-related problems, mostly having to do with carb ice. Compared to the fuel problems that we just talked about, the incidence of true mechanical problems with engines causing power loss, component failures, is relatively small. And of those, these were the principal culprits. There were 23 power loss accidents caused by cylinder failures, 16 connecting rod failures, 16 magneto failures, and 11 pump failures, probably most of them fuel pumps. The 74% of the accidents were caused by pilots, but 23% of the accidents were caused by mechanics, caused by maintenance errors. The remaining 3% were caused by aircraft design problems, but the aircraft design problems are a relatively insignificant cause of these accidents. And of the maintenance-related accidents, power loss accidents, I found it quite interesting that the biggest group of maintenance-related power loss accidents had to do with overhauls. 57 overhaul errors, 43 errors of assembly or installation, and 12 errors in repairs. And of course, any of you who've been following my writing and my preaching know that I am a big fan of not overhauling healthy engines just because they've reached TBO. And the logic is, and I've shown lots of statistics on this in the past, that the overwhelming majority of engine failure accidents are infant mortality problems, not age-related problems. That is, if you fall out of the sky with an engine failure, it's almost always going to be because with a young engine, not with an old engine. And these figures that Jim came up with in his analysis pretty much underscore the risk that's involved when an engine is overhauled. There just is a significant infant mortality risk with those engines until the overhauled engine has had a little time in service to prove itself. You really have to be pretty suspicious of it. So I found that interesting. Finally, we had a rousing discussion on the subject of airworthiness directives and AMOCs. This was one of our big hot buttons with the engine propeller folks. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we discussed, but it was, we had some pretty heated discussions about that at the meeting. Of course, you all know what airworthiness directives are. AMOC stands for Alternative Means of Compliance, and it's a mechanism whereby an aircraft owner can request a different way of addressing a safety problem if he doesn't like what an airworthiness directive says. So we discussed both of these subjects. And the head of that discussion was a fellow by the name of Chris Richards, who actually was the host of this whole meeting on behalf of the FAA. Chris works for the Engine Propeller group and is the guy that's in charge of most of the piston engine projects for this group. So he's a very good guy, and we've been working with him now for quite a while. And it's nice to have somebody like that to deal with it at fairly high levels in the FAA. At any rate, Chris talked to us about the responsibility of the Aircraft Certification Service with respect to what the FAA calls continued operational safety. And their responsibilities for continued operational safety. If you think about it, the AIR's primary responsibility is getting things certified. But their job isn't over when things are certified. They have to monitor the safety of those things that they certify. And when safety problems arise, they have an ongoing responsibility to deal with those things. And that's what the continued operational safety part of their job is all about. So the COS responsibility of the AIR folks consists of gathering data on potential unsafe conditions, performing numerical risk analyses to try to figure out just how unsafe those conditions are, collecting candidate corrective actions for dealing with the unsafe conditions, and then ultimately convening a formal Corrective Action Review Board, CARB, which is the process that they now use to decide what corrective action is appropriate. and the CARB will look at the data, at the numerical risk analyses, at the candidate corrective actions, and make a decision as to whether a corrective action is warranted, and if so, what kind of corrective action it could be. It could be an airworthiness directive. It could, if it's particularly severe, it could be a special airworthiness information bulletin. It could be one of the various informational kinds of things that the FAA does, or they could decide not to take any action at all. Once the CARB decides what corrective action is appropriate, then they're responsible for drafting the selected corrective action. And in the case that it's an AD, which is the one case that actually requires rulemaking, they normally have to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking, NPRM, that gives the public an opportunity to comment on the proposed AD, address the comments that come in during the comment period, and ultimately issue the final rule. So these are the things that are the responsibilities of aircraft certification with respect to continued operational safety. Chris was the first to admit that this COS process works pretty well for the airlines, doesn't work terribly well for general aviation. The problem with general aviation with regard to COS is manifold. First of all, for GA, event reporting is far less complete and accurate. The fact that the event reporting is not complete and accurate means that it's very hard for them to do the numerical risk analysis that they want to do to determine the level of risk. With general aviation, they have a problem that the operators are very cost sensitive, so they have to agonize over the risk versus cost evaluation, which is something they typically don't have to worry about with the airlines, because the airlines are less cost sensitive and the public demands a very, very, very high level of safety with regard to the airlines. And finally, the FAA has good ongoing communications with aircraft and engine manufacturers, but traditionally has not had very good ongoing communications with the people who are most affected by these ADs, which are the aircraft owners and operators. And we've been working hard the last few years to do a better job of organizing on behalf of aircraft owners and having better lines of communications with the FAA. And these two general aviation aircraft summit meetings that we've had are perfect examples of attempts that we're making to open the lines of communications and get a dialogue going between the FAA and aircraft owners in a way that traditionally hasn't happened in the past. So this is a problem, it's a recognized problem, and it's one that we're all trying to work on, both the FAA and the alphabet groups that represent aircraft owners. Unlike the airlines, few general aviation operators have their own engineering staffs or their own custom maintenance programs, and so most of us in GA are reliant on the recommendations from aircraft and engine manufacturers as far as what kinds of maintenance and so on should be done. The airlines, on the other hand, typically develop their own maintenance programs, and they are in control of that. The manufacturer's best interests are often quite different from the aircraft owner's best interests. We as aircraft owners are interested in minimum cost. The manufacturer's interested in minimum liability, and we often are at loggerheads with one another. And again, the airlines are in a much stronger position in this regard, because if they don't like what the manufacturers recommend, they develop their own maintenance programs, get them FAA approved. They have engineering staffs to do that. We in GA typically don't have that capability, and so we're much more at the mercy of the manufacturers, and that creates a significant problem for GA with regard to continued operational safety. To help deal with this situation, We worked with the FAA back in 2001. We worked with the Small Airplane Directorate to create a new thing called an airworthiness concern sheet. And the purpose of the airworthiness concern sheet was twofold. First of all, it was to help the FAA gather the data they need when some kind of an unsafe condition gets on their radar screen. And on the other hand, it gave the GA owner and operators, or the groups representing them, a heads up that the FAA was thinking about issuing AD, so that they could get engaged early with the FAA and have a more meaningful voice in the whole COS process. So we made a deal in the wake of a particularly bloody AD battle back in 2000, having to do with twin Cessna exhausts. We sat down with the head of the Small Airplane Directorate and said there has to be a better way to do business with one another. And we came up with this airworthiness concern sheet process. Here's what an airworthiness concern sheet looks like. The FAA is now supposed to issue one of these when they are starting to be concerned about some unsafe condition with regards to general aviation. And they're supposed to send this airworthiness concern sheet out to AOPA, EAA, and relevant type clubs. If the problem is for example, a problem with beach bonanzas, it's supposed to go to the American Bonanza Society, so that the owner community can get an early heads up that the FAA is concerned about something, and we can both provide the FAA data on what we know about this problem and also get involved in an early dialogue with the FAA. And it's really important to be able to talk to the FAA about this kind of stuff before the FAA convenes a CARB and their rulemaking machinery is set into motion. Because once rulemaking is in process, once an NPRM is issued, there are these ex parte communications rules that makes it impossible to have discussions. We can make comments to the docket in a very formalized way, but we can't just sit down at the table and talk about stuff anymore. We can't have a Skype call, and so in order to be able to discuss this thing in a non-adversarial situation, we need to get engaged early. We need to get engaged before the FAA actually starts its rulemaking work. And that's one of the reasons for this whole airworthiness concern sheet issue, is to give the owner associations an early heads up that the FAA is thinking about maybe issuing an AD, so that we can start talking to them about it early on. So anyway, I think I've said all of this. Now, originally in 2001, the deal we made with the FAA was a deal we made with the Small Airplane Directorate, so that the ACS would be issued with regard to small airplane issues. But we had a problem in 2014. The FAA started working on a very, very draconian airworthiness directive against ECI cylinders that some of you may recall. And they didn't issue an ACS. And they didn't issue an ACS on the basis that the Fort Worth ACO that was handling this said, this is not a Small Airplane Directorate issue. This is an Engine and Propeller Directorate issue. ACS is only applied to the Small Airplane Directorate. Even though all these engines were mounted in small airplanes, that the Fort Worth folks arbitrarily took the position that this was not a small airplane problem. This was an engine and propeller problem. So they didn't issue an ACS. So at our first summit meeting in 2015 up in Burlington, we talked to the FAA about this, and we said this ACS process should also apply to engine and propeller issues as they affect general aviation. And they agreed to that. And so the process was extended so that it would also affect engine propeller stuff as well as small airplane stuff. Now, of course, all of this is somewhat mooted by this reorganization, but generally everybody agrees now that when the FAA is contemplating an airworthiness directive that would affect general aviation, it's supposed to issue an ACS and give us an early heads up so that we can engage early with the FAA on before AD rulemaking starts to happen. So we discussed with the FAA at this meeting two things that happened this year that illustrated the good and the bad and the ugly. The good thing that happened was earlier this year, the FAA issued an ACS with regard to a proposed action against Continental camshaft gears on Continental 520 and 550 engines. Would have been extremely costly to tens of thousands of GA aircraft owners. Continental issued a mandatory service bulletin that literally brought the resale market for aircraft powered by these engines to a screeching halt. It was the potential disaster. And because of the ACS and because we were able to get into constructive conversations with the FAA early, and in this case we were dealing with the Atlanta ACO that has oversight over Continental Motors. Eventually we got into three-way discussions with the ACO and Continental Motors, and ultimately we were able to persuade the FAA not to issue an AD on the basis that the risk involved in this particular camshaft gear issue was so small. There had been so few incidents of problems with these gears that we persuaded them that it was not appropriate to issue an AD, and we were able to persuade Continental Motors to downgrade their mandatory service bulletin into a non-mandatory service bulletin. So that was a huge win for GA aircraft owners. But then hard on the heels of that, just a couple of months later, we had this recent debacle that I've written about with the Lycoming connecting rod bushing problem, where the FAA decided not to issue an ACS and denied GA owners any meaningful input into the COS process, ramrodded through an emergency AD without any public comment period, even though we had proposed to them an alternative method of dealing with this issue that we thought would be much more acceptable to the owners. And at this meeting, we were very vocal in our displeasure at how the Lycoming AD was handled. We got the FAA to admit that they hadn't handled it very well, and we asked them to try not to let this sort of kind of thing happen again in the future. What happens in the future remains to be seen. But again, we had these two really interesting examples to discuss with the FAA this year, one that went very well and one that went very badly. And we compared and contrasted them and said, you know, we need to do it more like the Continental thing was done and a lot less like the Lycoming thing was done. We also discovered, we also discussed the issue of alternative means of compliance. If an operator doesn't like a corrective action that's mandated by an airworthiness directive and thinks that there's a better way to address the unsafe condition, there are provisions in the regulations that allow an operator to propose an alternative means of compliance to the FAA. The proposal is normally submitted to the ACO that was responsible for the AD in the first place, and the ACO will ask the operator to provide supporting data to show that the alternative means that's being proposed will achieve an acceptable level of safety. And if the FAA is convinced that it would provide an acceptable level of safety, then the FAA will approve the AMOC, and the operator can use this alternative means rather than comply with the AD as written. This is a mechanism that's been around for a long time. The airlines use it all the time, but historically, general aviation has not used it very much, mostly because it takes a lot of engineering work to put together an AMOC proposal and to provide all of the supporting data that the FAA needs to make a determination that the alternative means proposed of compliance provides an acceptable level of safety. And very few GA operators have that capability to do that. At our first engine summit in 2015, we discussed this, and the FAA urged various GA owner groups to make better use of the AMOC mechanism, saying, maybe individual GA operators don't have the engineering talent to be able to put together AMOC proposals, but the owner groups should be able to do that on behalf of the owners, and to propose what are called global AMOCs, that are an AMOC that is applicable not to just one operator, but to multiple operators, or maybe all of the operators in the fleet that are affected by an AD. So we paid attention to that, and then when the FAA issued this horrible AD against ACY cylinders and Continental engines against our protest, that was the one where they didn't issue an ACS for the reason that I mentioned. AOPA, in partnership with several affected type associations, and I was heavily involved in this personally, prepared a proposed AMOC that would allow the condemned ACY cylinders to remain in service until TBO under certain controlled conditions. We sent this AMOC to the Engine and Propeller Directorate. They wound up sending it down to Fort Worth, and Fort Worth essentially sent us a letter rejecting it and saying that they hadn't proved that it would achieve an acceptable level of safety, and basically asking us to prove the unprovable. We discussed this at length at the meeting. We said, look, you guys, last time we met, you guys said make better use of the AMOC mechanism. We tried, and you shot it down. So what are we supposed to do? The FAA said they didn't really mean to shoot it down. They were trying to invite further discussion, but when we looked over the letter that they sent us, it sure looked like a shoot down to everybody. So we talked this over for a while. Everybody said, gee, it shouldn't have worked like this, and we all agreed to try better next time. So again, these were the kinds of discussions that went on in this meeting, and it was a very useful meeting. And it's really good to have lines of communication open between GA owner community and the FAA. That's been something that's has been very weak historically, and we're trying to do better. So at the end of the meeting, we all agreed that these meetings are useful. We tentatively scheduled the next one to be held about the same time, September of 2018. And hopefully we'll have some good stuff to report next year. But so my purpose in doing this webinar tonight was to bring everybody up to date on what transpired at this meeting, and so you know that what's going on, and that we're really trying to work hard with the FAA to make things better with respect to some of these engine issues. And with that, Tim, I don't know if I'm going to be able to hear you, but I'll do my best.
All right, Mike, can you hear me now?
Very, very weakly. I'm going to try to figure out why that is, but.
Okay. Hopefully everybody else can hear me okay. Maybe there's a volume control on your headset there.
Yes, there is, and I just solved the problem. I can hear you perfectly now.
Right on. Okay, let's start with John's question here. He says about electric and hybrids. It's sort of interesting, but we've already seen these in small and not so small cars. Was there any discussion of autonomous aircraft standards? I've seen numerous articles in Defense News and elsewhere, civil aviation predicting AI introduction in an only slightly slower pace than electric propulsion systems. How does the FAA appear to be anticipating this?
Well, that's a great question. The fact is, that subject was not discussed at the meeting. It would have been wonderful for it to have been discussed because it's a fascinating area. And I think primarily the reason it wasn't discussed was that this meeting was predominantly with the engine and propeller group, who is intimately involved with electric propulsion. But the question of autonomous aircraft would really be a question that would have been dealt with by the small airplane, what used to be the Small Airplane Directorate. And although there were one or two people from that group at the meeting, this was a meeting that was primarily organized by the engine and propeller folks and dealt with the issues that the engine propeller folks are primarily dealing with. We often run into a situation where the FAA organization does not fit our mission very well. To be perfectly frank, the FAA organization was primarily optimized, I think, to deal with airlines. And general aviation is a bit of a force fit into the FAA organization, and so we run into this sorts of things. It brings up the point that it would probably be very useful to try to get a similar kind of annual meeting going with the small aircraft, the small airplane folks in Kansas City, and I'll try to run that idea up the flagpole and see if anybody's interested. But that's the reason I think that subject of autonomous aircraft, which has to be maybe an even more interesting subject than electric aircraft, was not discussed at this meeting.
Okay, Mark's wondering, it concerns me to hear about the FAA attempting to come up with standards for the electric propulsion. Electric aircraft propulsion is evolving very fast. Do you think that creating standards is going to stifle innovation? It seems to me that they should be creating certification safety guidelines, not standardizing the propulsion themselves.
Well, first of all, of course, certification always interferes with innovation. I mean, that's almost its purpose, I think, is to slow things down. But we are operating in a world of the new FAR Part 23, which just was released earlier this year, that does do more or less what you're discussing, which is that instead of the FAA having regulations on how to accomplish something, they have regulations specifying what safety goals need to be achieved, and they leave how to meet those safety goals up to the manufacturer. Now, the manufacturer can address the how to achieve question in several different ways. They can comply with industry consensus standards that have been accepted by the FAA. These are typically developed by committees of ASTM, and everybody who's followed the LSA thing understands how that works. The manufacturer doesn't have to comply with an ASTM consensus standard, but if he doesn't, then he has the individual burden to prove to the FAA that his novel approach, let's say he has an approach that he wants to keep a trade secret, and so he can't discuss it with ASTM because then it becomes public. So he decides that he's going to do it outside of the ASTM process. Well, he can do that under the new Part 23, but then the burden of proof that this new thing meets the FAA's safety goals is on the manufacturer, and that can get to be a very, very heavy burden and very, very expensive and time consuming. So the thought is that most manufacturers will follow the ASTM consensus standards in order to take the path of least resistance to certification. They're not required to do that, but that's the anticipation is that that's how most new aircraft and innovative aircraft will wind up getting certified. So again, the FAA is actively involved in trying to get this consensus standard put together first for simple electric power plants that would be used in small GA aircraft. That consensus standard is not the only way to get an electric aircraft certified. It's just the easiest way to get it certified. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, Walt is wondering, will a new unleaded avgas approved in the USA be rolled out globally? Or are there other suppliers of 100 low lead outside of the USA?
Well, there was really no discussion at this meeting of anything with regard to the alternative fuels outside the U.S. Of course, 100 low lead is much scarcer outside the U.S. than it is inside the U.S. My guess is that once the FAA has done whatever it takes to get these two new fuels approved fleet-wide, other countries' CAAs will accept these things. But there was no discussion of international implications of the alternative fuel initiative at this meeting.
Okay, Walt's wondering, did the power loss accidents in the twin engine imply that both engines failed?
No, that would be, it is possible for both engines to fail in the case of fuel exhaustion, for example, but my guess is that the vast majority of the power loss accidents in twins wound up being VMC roll kinds of things where one engine failed and the pilot lost control of the aircraft.
Carl's wondering if there was any discussion about expanding the Swift Fuel 94 UL availability.
Well, there was no discussion about sub 100 octane fuels at the meeting. That's not what the PAFI is about, which is what they were presenting. The FAA's primary interest is in certifying a fuel that will be able to replace 100 low lead on a fleet-wide basis. And there are a subset of GA aircraft that can operate on fuels less than 100 octane. But it's my impression that the FAA is not focused on trying to come up with a sub 100 octane fuel. They're trying to solve the entire fleet-wide problem in one fell swoop, not trying to segment the aircraft into different groups, those that can. you know, it's interesting that there are, of the 167,000 aircraft that currently run on 100 low lead, there are a significant number of those aircraft that can run on less than 100 low lead fuel, or less than 100 octane fuel. However, the vast majority of the fuel is consumed by the group of aircraft that can't run on less than 100 octane. The higher performance aircraft, which are the ones with the most the greatest octane requirements, are the ones that consume the lion's share of the fuel. So the FAA has not shown any particular interest in getting involved in sub-100 octane alternative fuels.
Richard is wondering, is it the FAA's plan to approve both unleaded fuels being tested, or just the best, or one that functions the best?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It was brought up at the meeting. I didn't get a real clear answer to it, but I got a pretty strong impression. And the impression was that I got was in a fairly hot exchange between the FAA fuels guy and Doug McNair of EAA, who's been eyeball deep in this whole fuels issue since the beginning. The FAA's position is, I think, that they're going to try to get both of these fuels approved fleet-wide, unless they run into some showstoppers. Doug's opinion that he voiced in very forcefully in only a way that Doug McNair can do was that from a practical standpoint, only one of these two fuels is going to survive, because the industry is not prepared to support more than one replacement fuel. So what I took out of that discussion, as somebody who has not been involved in this the way either the FAA guy or Doug have been, was that the FAA is seeking approval for both of the fuels, but it's very unlikely that both of them will survive commercially, because the industry is not interested in having two alternative fuels.
Bill is saying the UL fuel efforts, are these aimed at developing a fuel that will not require engine modifications then?
That's the hope. That's definitely the hope. It is possible that that part of this approval process may be some changes to POHs and stuff, but the FAA's hope is that those things will either not happen or will be very, very minor. The hope is that it will not require any modifications to the engines, and more importantly, not require modifications to the fuel system components. That's why they're doing so much materials testing.
Mm-hmm. Joe's asking, I've heard there were issues with these fuels peeling paint on aircraft. Have you heard anything about that?
Wasn't discussed. I'm not sure peeling paint is in the engine and propeller group's wheelhouse. I honestly don't know the answer to that. It wasn't discussed.
Riza says, you mentioned differing interests of owners and manufacturers, aka costs versus liability. One extreme case of this seems to be the Rotax 5-year rubber replacement. In your opinion, is that requirement an extreme case of liability aversion by Rotax, or is there something real there? How come Lycoming and Continental hoses can last a TBO, but Rotax can't?
Well, probably because Lycoming and Continental don't have hoses. The hoses in Lycoming and Continental installations are not considered part of the engine. They're considered part of the airframe, and so the manufacturer, it's not part of what the manufacturers worry about. The Rotax engine is different in that it is liquid cooled, and so it has a bunch of hoses that are part of the engine certification itself. And so Rotax is worried about hoses in a way that Lycoming and Continental are not worried about them.
John is asking, what is the expected retirement from service of our current median-aged 36 years GA fleet of fixed-wing aircraft, and will the fuels be economical in the long term?
Well, that's a question above my pay grade, but we're still flying warbirds from the 40s, so I don't know. None of these legacy aircraft, like the one I fly, were ever intended to last as long as we've made them last, and it is becoming an increasing struggle. I wrote my monthly blog post this month on the AOPA Opinion Leaders blog, having just come out of the annual inspection on my airplane, and the title of the blog post was Unobtainium and Unaffordium, which are the two materials of which our aircraft seem to be made. So it is becoming more and more challenging to keep these things flying, and how long people will continue to put up with that, it's hard to say.
All right, Mike. Well, we're kind of at the end here. I sure do appreciate you taking the time. It was really fascinating to me to watch your presentation and hear your summary of what that meeting was, to kind of hear the back door that we pilots and owners never really hear about. And, it was really an interesting presentation. Thank you so much for that tonight. Please take a moment, share closing comments with the audience. I know we had probably about 420 people logged in tonight.
Well, my pleasure, Tim. There are only a relative handful of people in the owner community that get involved at this level. Obviously, the folks at the alphabet groups and so on, and I think that most aircraft owners don't have a good enough idea of what kind of stuff is going on behind the scenes on their behalf. So that's why I decided to do the webinar tonight. As usual, I'll just say if you're not presently receiving my monthly e-newsletter, you can sign up for it at savvyaviation.com, or Tim is going to put up a post-webinar survey after we're done here, and if you take that survey, there'll be a checkbox that you can check if you want, and if you want to get on the mailing list for my newsletter. My book manifesto remains on sale at Amazon. It's a book I wrote about my maintenance philosophy. I've been getting a lot of mail lately on it. Starting to get a lot of A&Ps that are reading it now, which is very encouraging to me. I'm presently working hard at work on my next book on aircraft engines, piston aircraft engines, that is hopefully will be out by AirVenture 2018. And as I said, I'm working on that right now. Hope to have it completed by the spring and publish it in print in time for the next AirVenture. If you'd like to get involved with me in the production of this book, I've got a group of sponsors that are working with me on the book. You can find out about that by going to my Patreon site at patreon.com/savvyaviator. I guess I didn't fill in that last one, Tim. I had made up my mind, and I forgot. That was supposed to be the last thing I did on the slides, is make up my mind what the January webinar is going to be, and I got distracted. So that'll have to be TBD. The next two upcoming first Wednesday of the month webinars. Wednesday, November 1st, is going to be a webinar on single pilot IFR. It's going to talk about a study that the NASA Aviation Safety Reporting System commissioned some years ago on single pilot IFR errors and what we can do to minimize them. It was a very interesting study, and it's the things that they came up with then are just as applicable today as they were then. So I'm going to be talking about that. And the December webinar is entitled Grand Theft Propeller, and it's about it starts off with the story of an A&P mechanic who was doing an annual inspection on an airplane and found that the propeller was so corroded and unairworthy that he not only declared it as unairworthy, but he wasn't willing to give it back to the owner because the owner wanted to put it up for sale on eBay. And we'll start with that story and talk about just what the obligations of an A&P are with respect to situations like that. Can a mechanic hold an aircraft hostage? Can he hold a part of an aircraft hostage? Can he get the FAA involved if he doesn't like something? And we'll get into some very interesting discussions based on that particular incident that the mechanic actually called me about. I had a long conversation with him, and I thought it was worth sharing. So that's what we'll be doing the next couple of webinars. And Tim, that's all I have.
Sounds great, Mike. Thank you so much. Yes, till next time, November 1st. Thank you so much. To everybody who tuned in tonight, thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone. See you next time.
Good night, everybody.